All right, why don't we get started? Sandy, can you hear me, and are you there? Sandy, I can't hear you. Are you on?
Can you hear me now?
I can. That's great.
Okay, good. Hear you.
Fantastic. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today to discuss Appraising into the Sun, a new report released today by LB&L. And I am Ben Hohen. I am joined by Sandy Adamatis. We are the co-authors of this report. And I'm going to start the presentation and let Sandy take it about halfway through. I just quickly want to thank the Department of Energy, the Solar Energy Technologies Office for supporting this work. Obviously, we couldn't do it without their support. So with that, why don't we dive into the presentation today. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We have a number of people on the call, and therefore we are not going to be opening the lines for questions, but rather receiving questions via the chat window. So if you want to see if you can hunt that down on your control panel, I see somebody has put in a test question. Feel free to enter that question at any time during the presentation, and then we'll pick up those questions after the presentation and answer them in the order that they came in. So the goal today, we're just going to briefly do a little background on Sandy and myself, and then dive into the background of why this work is important, how it fits within the broader context of solar energy deployment in the U.S. I'm going to also touch on the previous literature that preceded this work to give you a sense of how it fits within that work. And then I'm going to let Sandy dive into the research. Ultimately, we're going to come out of that with some conclusions and then touch a little bit on some upcoming LB&L research in the same area. So I hope you come away from this with a good understanding of what we did. I should let you know that this PowerPoint, as well as the report and a 2-page summary, are going to be available, or already available, on the website. I think you can Google Appraising into the Sun, and you should be able to find that. If not, you can find it on our LB&L research site. And this webinar is also being recorded, so we will have that up as well. So if there are questions that come out of the webinar that are in the webinar, you want to check back on that, you can find that. I believe we're going to post that on a YouTube site. But that will be, the link to that will be available also on the website where we will store Appraising into the Sun. So let's quickly introduce Sandy. She is a luminary in the field of valuing green energy properties, both commercial and residential. She's an author, as an instructor, as a speaker, and often called upon to help guide individuals think about how we move from basically no deployment many years ago to growing demand for understanding how to value these structures, both energy efficiency and renewable energy assets on properties. So I'm very lucky to be able to work with her in this effort that we'll be describing today. I am a staff research associate at Berkeley Lab. My work is generally focused on renewable energy and public acceptance, and so I've done some work in solar energy as well as wind energy, and I have a degree in finance and business, and most recently environmental policy, and have written a good deal on the subject of valuation of solar energy, though I have to say I'm pretty excited about this work today in comparison to the work we've done in the past. It's really, really different. So in addition to Sandy and myself, we also tapped the expertise of a number of appraisers that were familiar with their local market so that therefore they could better value the homes, the PV homes that were there in that market. And that includes Sarah Houston, Jay Kimmel, Joel Tate, Taylor, Watkins, Lynn Dordahl, and John Szymanski. So we're very lucky to have had them help us out with this role. All right, so what's the background in which this work sits in terms of the U.S. solar market? I should say PV is often interchanged with solar, and so I think I'm going to be saying PV much more than solar, but I hope you understand that that's just an acronym. Photovoltaic means solar energy system. And so PV is more affordable than ever. We've seen a major drop in the price of PV going back to 2007 and 2008. Most of that drop has come from a decrease in the hardware costs associated with these energy systems. So that would be the inverters and the appraisers. But we've also seen a big drop in, or somewhat of a drop in the soft cost aspects of the installation. So customer acquisition and the installation and marketing and that sort of thing. And interestingly, the same folks that sponsored this work under the Sunshot Initiative are also doing a lot of work in terms of bringing down those soft costs. And so that's where this work fits in. And so we've seen this big drop in prices, and that, of course, has driven the market to some degree. And some of those low prices are being helped by other things in the market, such as additional incentives on top of those low prices. So we've had a very stable national policy and often stable state and sometimes utility policies to incentivize the installation of solar. And though we have a federal uncapped 30% investment tax credit now, that's actually going to be expiring at the end of 2016 unless we have a policy change that would allow it to be extended. And otherwise it will revert to 10%. So with that, that's been helping drive the market, as well as some market innovations, which I'm sure most of you on the call are familiar with, in terms of third-party ownership of solar systems. So that would include leases and PPAs. That, of course, has given the opportunity for many homeowners to consider having a system installed on their house for no money down. And as you can see from the figure from the right, that has dominated the market recently and has obviously been one of the big drivers to deployment. Now, with these low prices and stable policies and new market innovations in terms of financing, we've seen lots of installations. So we have over 725,000, so almost 750,000 U.S. residential installations through Q2 2015. And most of those are in California, in part because of the population in California, but also in part because of the enormous and longstanding policy driving installations there. But we see as well robust markets in Hawaii and Arizona and New York and New Jersey and Colorado, Massachusetts, and other states as well. So those 725,000 constitute approximately 1%, maybe a little less, of the U.S. housing stock, and approximately 0.13% of the U.S. electricity generation. So we have plenty of room to go here in terms of developing this market. But clearly this is a significant amount of homes that now have PV. Now, even though we have, let's say, 1% or less than 1% of the U.S. housing stock having PV across the U.S., in some locales we've seen much higher penetration. So these next two slides are examples of penetrations in various jurisdictions. So these are townships in Massachusetts, and as you can see from the coloring, in some townships we have a penetration of 18 to 32%, in others 7 to 18%, and then many more, somewhere between 1 and 7%. So we have higher penetrations depending on where you look in the U.S. This is, you can imagine what a township would be like with somewhere between 18 and 32% of the homes having PV if a home transacted in that locale. Obviously, that would be one that would require a knowledge of solar and maybe an understanding as to how it would be impacted when it did so. So that's Massachusetts as well. In San Diego, we have higher penetration rates as well, ranging from, all the way up to almost 18%. You can see there are much more higher penetration jurisdictions here. These are zip codes in San Diego. So even though we have a relatively small number of homes across the U.S., we've got a high percentage in some locales. And we could probably make the same map in lots of other markets around the U.S. So that is a bit of understanding as to how the market has deployed, but how about thinking about what might happen in the market in the future, specifically in terms of demand for those solar systems on homes? Well, one way to look at this is through this National Association of Realtors survey that asks prospective buyers what green features would be important to them. And 12% say that solar is either important or very important. And that's interesting in part because that's obviously likely to not be the amount of homes that are available for them to purchase. Therefore, we've got a situation with higher demand than there is supply of those homes. And I'm getting some little chats here on the side that I can't ignore, and I'd like to immediately correct that I did make a mistake in terms of the reversion of the ITC. That is going to 0 for residential and 10% for commercial. So thank you for that correction. And it's also been pointed out that some of those townships in Massachusetts have seen that high amount of deployment because of solarized programs. So those are great additions. Thank you. So if you're considering installing a solar system, obviously the price is very important to you, but there's another consideration that often folks will think about, in that these systems will be on the home for quite a long time. In some cases, that might be longer than the homeowner expects to be in the home. So it's an open question for many of these individuals as to how the value of the home would be affected by the presence of that system. Some work's been done to look at this. For instance, there's been a number of large-scale statistical studies that have looked at this issue, starting back from Barbara Fajar's work in 2008 to work that was recently published this year by us at the Berkeley Lab with Sandy and Tom Jackson and a number of other folks participating in that work. Now, these studies take the idea that the best way to analyze data is to analyze it on a broad scale, and therefore you can have a high degree of statistical precision around your estimate. And then you can clearly see whether a market is responding to PV or not, and also be able to draw out potentially very slight relationships that wouldn't be available if you were looking at small numbers of homes. So that's what these kinds of studies exploit. And in all of them, there's been a clear indication that the market is responding to the presence of solar for host-owned PV systems, those that are owned by the homeowner as opposed to leased. Now, these are very useful studies for that purpose, but not very useful for individual markets where it's difficult for them to apply these kinds of results, especially for an individual home. So some others have sought to fill that gap. For instance, Lisa Demarai and Taylor Watkins, both in Colorado and in Oregon, have looked to do smaller scale studies using appraisal techniques such as paired sales of individual homes to see whether the same kind of patterns emerge. And they have found similar results. They found premiums for solar homes. So our work fits in with this work, the work that we'll be talking about today, in that it is small scale analysis conducted by appraisers on individual homes in these markets. So as we've seen some evidence of premiums emerging from the various studies, we've also seen some movement in terms of the institutional support for recognizing solar's value. So for instance, Fannie Mae in their single-family selling guide has pointed out that solar should be incorporated in the appraisal because it can add value, and given some guidance as to how that might be done. And similarly, in the FHA Single-Family Housing Policy Handbook that would be used for ensuring the value of a mortgage, they have also said that homes with solar that are owned by the homeowner should be appraised accordingly. So we see some institutional support. Now, that is great, but there are some big barriers to just simply starting to do that. And one of them is that often appraisers who are most familiar with a sales comparison approach, and I'll describe that in a moment, and as well, underwriters aren't as comfortable with other approaches. And in some markets, it's very difficult to find an ability. There's a very difficult time in some cases to be able to conduct a sales comparison approach. So we need additional methods and expanded methods for valuation, those that are accepted for the presence of PV. So it's a unique kind of problem. And I'm going to stop on this slide just to describe these various methods in a little bit more detail, because we'll be referring to them as we go through the report. So ideally, you'd have a scenario where these three approaches, sales comparison, income, and cost, all kind of line up, and therefore you have a really strong sense as to what is the market value for any asset that you are appraising, or any piece of real estate or asset on that real estate. So the sales comparison approach is when you compare, let's say in this case, a PV home to non-PV home, as in the paired sales approach, or to groups of PV homes to groups of non-PV homes in the large-scale statistical analysis approach. Those are both sort of take advantage of the fact that there might be some differences between these two homes. You control for the differences of those homes, and then hopefully exploit the fact that if a premium exists based on the presence of PV, it should pop out. So that's a very familiar approach to most people that are in the business of valuing residential structures. The income approach is less common. The income approach exploits the idea that for an asset that has a stream of, in this case, energy cost savings, or in other cases, income, you can discount that stream of savings or income to the present value, and therefore establish a value to that asset based on that stream of savings. So that's an income approach. It's very commonly used for rental incomes, but less commonly used by residential appraisers, and therefore less commonly applied to problems with valuation in that context. But it's perfect for this scenario. There's a tool called PV Value, which some of you might already be familiar with. You can find it by going to pvvalue.com. It's free. It was developed by Sandia National Lab and Energy Sense Finance. There are some non-free versions that give you additional functionality, but you can just log in if you want to and put in some information about your PV system or a PV system of interest, and it will spit out a series of values, a low, medium, and high estimate for the value of that system based on the income approach. And the final approach is the cost approach. And one can think about it this way. If you were to buy a car that was used, you surely wouldn't pay more for that car than what it would cost you to buy that car new. And that is a replacement cost. And so there's generally a theory that the costs or the market value of things would not exceed their replacement cost. And that makes sense. Well, in the case of PV, we could think of that replacement cost as the gross cost. And this is the cost, the gross cost for the system prior to any reductions in value or cost based on the incentives that are available. If you were to take into account the incentives, the federal incentives or state or utility incentives, you might think of it as the net cost. And I'm going to make that distinction between gross and net, or Sandy will throughout our presentation as we're looking at the results. It's very important to think about the differences between those two. So that gives you a sense of those various aspects and gives you a sense a little bit about the literature that preceded our work. So with that, we had some limitations that we thought this work could help fill. For instance, appraisal-led studies had only been conducted in 2 states. It would be very good to conduct them in other markets. None of the appraisal results had been directly compared to the statistical results, and therefore they kind of were set apart. Our work helped to fill that gap. Time on the market, which is an interesting question in and of itself. Do PV homes sell for faster than non-PV homes? Had only been looked at in 1 study, so we thought it would be good to come back to that. The appraisal results, so the paired sales results, had not been compared to both income and cost approaches in especially taking into account the net cost approaches in any one of the studies. So we have those 3 different ways to value: income, gross, and net costs. It'd be great to compare them to the appraisal results. And that was one gap we were able to fill. And finally, I mentioned that in some markets you can't, we had heard that appraisers have had a difficult time finding sales to pair. And so we thought one of the interesting things that can come out of this work is an examination of how that actually goes down in real time. And so that was one of also the gaps that we filled by this work. So let's see here. I think that brings us to the top of the results. So at this point, I'll go one more slide. I will turn it over to Sandy. And I guess I'll quickly deal with one question here, which is, does this work? Well, it's going to be right here on the slide. Does this work focus on host-owned systems? It does. I can talk a little bit about the work that is upcoming that will focus on third-party owned PV systems. So with that, Sandy, why don't I turn it over to you?
All right, thanks, Ben. I want to start by saying it's been a real honor to work with Ben on this and the other 7 appraisers, and quite an opportunity to learn a lot more about the solar PV and the markets. This work started back in 2014. We had already completed the hedonic modeling, so this was a great follow-up to it to see how it matched up as Ben set up for you. We completed this in late 2015. We've been real excited about presenting it. It involved 7 appraisers. I thought it was always best to have local appraisers that work in the market to be the ones doing the groundwork because they know their markets best. And of course, then I looked over all the data that was sent in, and in most cases, another appraiser from the same market also reviewed their work to assure that we were looking at good quality work that would be credible to the appraisal world. We had 6 states involved, and I'll show you a slide a little later about the 6 states that were involved in the appraiser-driven portion. When we started this, we gave the appraisers working in their own market sales from the same data set that we used in selling into the sun, the hedonic modeling set. So we had them we just gave them a spreadsheet with all the sales and had them to go through and try to find paired sales for as many as they possibly could. So it gave them a good data set to start with, and in some markets we had many more than others. And again, just like someone typed the question in here, this is host-owned only. We didn't do third-party owned systems. So this is just owned systems that we're studying in this market, or this report, which moves us to the transactions that were not usable. Like I told you, we gave them quite a few sales in spreadsheets and said, go through these and see if they all meet the definition of market value. We didn't want to use any that really weren't true market sales. If there were foreclosures, we eliminated them. If they weren't in the MLS or weren't on the market for a reasonable amount of time or were FSBOs, for sale by owners, we exclude them because they may not have sold at an appropriate price. And then there were a number of them that we couldn't use because we couldn't find a similar property that would ideally match up and give a credible result. So we only ended up using about 20% of the sales that we actually started out with. And again, I think that points to the problem that appraisers have in the field, that paired sales are very difficult to find every time we go out to appraise a home. So I think this helps to solidify the appraisers' reasons for not having paired sales or even having a sale on their sales comparison that would have the same PV system or a similar system. This ended up with our data set, final data set in all 6 states with 43 PV sales in the 6 states that we could actually pair up. And here we give you a rundown of those states. So we had California with the most. I was highly surprised at that one because we had a lot of sales data there. But pairing those sales was extremely difficult because of the uniqueness of California and the land and views and the extremes in styles and design. So we ended up with 13 there. In Florida, only found 4. We don't have a high percentage of our homes with solar PV on them, so that was a small number. Maryland, even smaller, with only 3. North Carolina is it has a lot of installations, but most of that is not on the residential side. So we only ended up with 7 in North Carolina. Oregon, we had 9, which we kind of thought we'd end up with more, but didn't. And then that was in the Portland area. Then we went to the Bend metro area and could only find 2 there. You have a unique problem there with house styles and age of homes and views, the same kind of thing we ran into in California. And then in Pennsylvania, we did end up with 5 paired sales. So that comprised our paired sale analysis for this study. Each of the appraisers, when they found a paired sale, they were given a form to fill out and to show all the data, and they had to provide us with the MLSs and the public record on each of the sales that they chose to use. So we, like Ben explained, we used a paired sale analysis, a sale with a PV system versus a similar house without a PV system. So they made adjustments for anything that's a little different, and then compared the adjusted sales prices, and if there's a difference and it shows that the sale with the PV system sold for more, then the difference could be attributed to the solar PV system. From that, then those same paired sales, I developed the income approach for each one of the systems. We had have systems where we could get enough information about them, age, size of the system, things of that nature, so we could put it into the PV value and develop a credible value using the income approach or discounted cash flow. I will say that we'll find on another sheet, we'll explain those a little more. We didn't drill down to very specific, we didn't have copies of the utility bills, so we had to use estimates on the actual kilowatt hour cost. We used a cost method, and the method we used was a gross cost, and then we used net, which would be the gross cost less any incentives or rebates that were available to bring it down to a net cost. And typically, appraisers are expected to use depreciated costs, meaning gross costs less all forms of loss through depreciation. So a brand new system could even have depreciation known as obsolescence. For instance, if the market's not willing to pay the gross cost, the difference between what they're willing to pay and what the gross cost is obsolescence. And with limited data, we haven't studied enough to know what exactly is that number. So we found that using net cost and gross cost was our best bet until we have better data to explain depreciation. It looks like the incentives and the rebates are offsetting any obsolescence or depreciation at this point. And you'll see that as we move along a little further. Appraisers looked at time on the market. We were trying to find out, did the homes with PV systems sell for more or less? And we'll show the results as we move along here. Our data set had a wide range of sale prices of homes. As you can see here, the minimum price that sale price of a home we looked at was $150,000, and that was in 2010, a 2010 sale. System was 1,000 watts, and everything that we do throughout here, we will be talking price per watt. That's how it's costed. Solar PV is costed. And that seemed to be the unit of value that was most consistent when you look at the data in the sales that we reviewed. And the minimum here was $405,000 with a mean of $431,964. As you can see, the highest price sale price of a house was $1,050,000 that we reviewed, and that was a 2014 sale. So that was the newest sale that we reviewed. And the income estimate on the minimum was $1.01 per watt, with the maximum at $4.42 a watt. And the gross cost was at a minimum of $4 a watt up to $7.30 a watt. And net cost was $1.48 a watt up to a maximum of $4.32 a watt.
Hey, so, Sandy.
Yes, go ahead,
I'm
Ben.
sorry. I just want to quickly correct here that the sale that was $150,000 and the sale that was $1 million weren't necessarily in the 2010 and 2014 sale year. The full data set spans 2010 to 2014, but that high price sale, for instance, might not have been in 2014.
You're right, Ben. Sorry. Thank you for correcting me on that.
Yeah.
All right, so let's move on to the next one now. These are where your sales price premiums come in. These numbers came from the paired sales. So this is the sales comparison or the paired sale analysis. And as you can see, we got it by state, and then we have all the homes grouped together. So you can see that the lowest price that we found in paired sale was $2.68 a watt, and that was in North Carolina. And the highest price was $4.31 a watt, and that was in California. Now let's think, why would that be? And let's move back to what is the utility cost price per kilowatt hour. It's the highest in California. So it makes sense that people would be more willing to pay a higher price for solar PV in California than they would, for instance, in North Carolina, where the cost per kilowatt hour is less. So those numbers fall right along with the kilowatt hour cost and with logic. The premiums apply, remember they apply the 2012 sales. So you might look at this and say, well, right now I can buy a system for less than this. Well, you got to remember that when you were looking at sales as of a specific date, you always look at that date. Now today, as prices have gone down, if we were to study that same market with new sales, 2015 sales, the paired sales may come up lower because the price has gone down. And that's what we were finding in the market, looking at older sales versus newer sales. As the price went down, so did the sales price premium from the paired sale analysis. So when we threw all of these in there together, you can see that the average was $3.78 a watt in all 6 states that we've studied. And I will point out that you can see Oregon is pretty high up there at $4.20 a watt. Their cost for their kilowatt hour was not that high. But that number falls along with the hedonic modeling as well. Kind of an unusual thing, and something we couldn't really pin down with data to tell us why would they be willing to pay so much more when they have a low kilowatt hour cost. And the only thing I can attribute it to would be green cachet, the attitude of buyers in that market. They have more concern for climate change. It's a fad. I don't know, but those are things that you might think about in Oregon. So I'm going to move on to the next slide here, where we compare the income, the premiums from the income approach versus the average. We've got California here with the red is the average income approach, and the blue is the premium from the sales comparison or the paired sales. And you can see in all cases the income approach using PV value was slightly lower. I attribute that to the fact that we didn't drill down to the exact price per kilowatt hour. That may have raised it in each one and brought it up closer to the sales price premiums. Although they're not that far off, it does provide us with a test of reasonableness. The second thing that the PV value provides us with is a test of its credibility. And because we often heard from appraisers, or didn't often, sometimes appraisers would report, well, the lender didn't want me to use the income approach because it's not applicable to residential, so they didn't want appraisers using the income. And I think this is a good argument for why appraisers should be using this as a test of reasonableness. The PV value gave us some pretty reliable indications here. And again, you're looking at the lowest we found on that with PV value was $1.78 versus $4.20 with the sales price premiums. So there you can see the PV values using the kilowatt hour costs. Again, we just could not explain that with any fact. That's where the hedonic modeling fell, and that's where the paired sales analysis fell as well. So let's move on to the next one here, where we show the gross cost, the net cost, and then the sales price premium from the paired sales. So the blue is in the paired sales. The darker green is the gross cost, and the light green is the net cost. And as you can see, which would be logic, the gross cost, that's before any incentives, rebates, anything of that nature, that was much higher than the other indications, which would make sense. No one's willing to pay cost new for a used system. And then the light green was the net cost. So that's the cost after the rebates and incentives. And as you can see, in most cases, again, except in Oregon, the net cost follows the sales price premium that we found from paired sales. So again, the cost approach using the net cost is a good test of reasonableness. So really using these three methods, it's a really good indication of what that solar PV is worth in the market, and should be something that Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and the lenders and underwriters should be reviewing this and having some confidence when appraisers use these methods that they are giving them something that's credible. Our next study here on this slide is days on the market. And as you can see, in most cases, or in some cases, the PV sales took a little longer to sell than the house without PV. That was true in North Carolina, but remember, we only had a few sales in North Carolina that we studied. Pennsylvania, we only had a few, but they sold took a lot longer to sell those in Pennsylvania than it did the non-PV systems. And I credit that to some of the comments made by listing agents or by selling agents. It seems like when something like this is new to the market and the public, the buying public, is not familiar with solar PV and the benefits of it, they're a little leery of it. So sometimes it takes a little longer to find that buyer that's willing to pay a price for that system. And when you have a listing agent that may not be familiar with it, it may not sell at its most probable price, because it's hard to sell something at the highest price if you're not familiar with how to articulate the benefit of solar PV. So again, in California, we had a lot of systems there, and you can see the PV systems and the non-PV system sales were very close, 25 days versus 22 days. In Florida, it was much different. As all along here, you can see there was no consistency here, so I would say it's we're really too new. We don't have enough data to really prove that solar PV is selling quicker in most of these markets. That may change as people become more familiar with the systems. Comparisons of the methods here. We've got selling into the sun. We used different methodologies than the hedonic modeling, and one of the reasons for that is in hedonic modeling, most residential appraisers, and remember, all these systems we measure were residential, none of them were commercial. In residential appraising, and appraisers are supposed to deem whatever work they use as creditable. So if they were to rely on hedonic modeling, they would need to understand how to explain hedonic modeling and understand the methodology used. In most cases, most of us would not feel comfortable in explaining hedonic modeling to an underwriter or to a lender. So appraisers shy away from using hedonic modeling as a data point for supporting adjustments. So that's why this work becomes so important, and it also adds credibility to the hedonic modeling when our methodology in appraising matches up with hedonic pricing. Our data sets overlap. Remember, we used the same data they did. And the time frames were a little different. The sales that we used from the appraiser-driven studies were from 2010 to 2014. And I think we only had one in 2014. Hedonic modeling used 2002 to 2013. Again, hedonic modeling had a much more robust data set because it spanned a larger number of years. But we wanted to use in the appraiser-driven study the most recent sales that we could find to make it more applicable to today. But again, I want to remind any appraiser on the line that if you're appraising something today, try to find something with a newer date, because the price of solar has gone down since some of these sales were studied. So both of these studies tell a similar story, which gives credibility here. So here we have the premiums are most similar to net cost. Again, in every market we found the sales price premiums were very close to the net cost of the system. So I think that an appraiser at this point could feel comfortable in looking at a net cost, but be sure you calculate your net cost correctly. DesireUSA.org was one resource where you can go in and find out what incentives or rebates are available. There are many other resources out there, and I know LBNL has a website where you can get some of those, and so does the Appraisal Institute. So research your incentives and rebates and take those off of your gross cost, and that'll give you a real good starting point. So here we have the Oregon. Again, you can see where results these results don't include Oregon because they just fell outside the range. So the paired sales results on the left side here and the hedonic modeling results on the right side. You can see how similar they are. So again, that's an excellent study of both methodologies, and they're both proving each other to be very similar and credible. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Ben, and he can fill in all the blanks that I left out and give us that summary.
I don't know if I can do that, Sandy. It's really a pleasure to hear you talk, and especially be able to relate to stories that are really about folks that are on the ground, because so much of this work is designed to apply to those individuals, but you're obviously connecting with them. So I'm going to round it out with two more slides here. We've got just the overall conclusions, just to summarize. One of the big things, as we've mentioned, is that in many markets, finding sales to pair can be very difficult. Therefore, it really makes sense to allow individuals that are seeking to value these properties the ability to use the income and cost approaches and have underwriters that trust them. We found that PV consistently adds value throughout our sample, whether we are looking at the broad sample or individual states. Clearly, there were premiums there. The net cost estimates seemed to be the better proxy than gross. Gross is all high in all cases. The income estimates generally were conservative in comparison to the premiums, yet they were correlated with the premiums. And as Sandy said, a good test of reasonableness. The results from the study seem to conform to those of the hedonic study, which bolsters both. Though obviously, if you're looking at transactions in your individual market, you need to estimate those premiums for that market. When no comparable sales, as we've been saying, are available, net cost and income methods do seem to be reasonable proxies. And finally, we didn't observe a difference in the days in the market. So can't emphasize enough the importance of establishing a value in any individual market. It could be that the incentives are different, the installed prices are different, the underlying retail electricity rates are different. So those need to all be taken into account when establishing a value. So last slide here, and this gets to some of the questions I've seen popping in, which is that we obviously there's a big demand for doing work in the area of valuing third-party owned homes that have third-party owned systems. The trick here is that those systems are actually not owned by the homeowner, so they can't be considered part of the real estate process. They are personal property that might be transferred outside of that process. Difficult to value them for that reason. But we are in the middle of conducting a survey of buyers, sellers, and realtors that were involved in some sales of third-party owned transactions in San Diego, and that should be coming out soon. We are going to do a statistical analysis using the hedonic pricing model of around 400 transactions of homes with third-party owned systems. And then we also will have with that work a paired sales analysis of approximately 30 homes. So Sandy's going to be working on that with us and as well as an academic team. We hope to have that out mid-next year. Separately, totally different than the valuation question, is how do we get these system characteristics out there for people to do their own valuation or even to search PV homes. We are working with Elevate Energy to develop a roadmap to examine ways that we might get PV system characteristics to auto-populate into multiple listing services. And then as well, LBNL will be doing some work focusing on the commercial PV market. So those are the upcoming pieces of work. I've got our information here. I probably should have put a link to the report, but I don't have that on the slide. I think obviously if you email us, we can send you that link. It is maybe soon you should be able to Google Appraising into the Sun and find it. I'm sorry for that, not having that if you haven't already seen it. It was out in the press. I guess it was in the webinar announcement today too, so you should have it for everybody that's on the call here. So that's great. We have a little bit of time here. It looks like 12 minutes to get us to the top of the hour to deal with some of the questions. And so Sandy, why don't I just kind of step through them and we can pinch hit as need be.
Okay.
Let's see here. Okay, question asked about additional research on third-party systems. We just talked about that. It's a big need, and hopefully we will fill in some of that gap. Let's see.
Do you take income question?
I'm sorry, what's that?
Can you explain income one more time? Can we take that one?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, the income approach that we use using the PV value tool is a discounted cash flow of the energy produced. For instance, you can go to the website and freely sign up, register it, and walk through it. We have a 2-day class that the Appraisal Institute offers, and we use that in our classroom. You need some special inputs, some information, characteristics about the solar system. For instance, you need to know how many watts it is or how many kilowatts, and you can convert that to watts. The size of the system and the kilowatt hour cost in that local area are 2 key important features, along with the age of the system and whether it's thin film or crystalline type the panels. So once you know enough about the system, you can put those inputs into the PV value tool. You have to know how long that system is warranted for. For instance, if it has a 25-year warranty and it's already 5 years old, the discounted cash flow would only go out 20 years because we use the life of the warranty term, which mirrors the life of the roof as the useful life of that system. Now, typically appraisers like to use economic life, but at this point we don't have enough data to prove economic life. So we're using the useful life of the system. So these systems could last longer than 25, produce energy for more than 30 years, but we're using the useful life remaining. So we would do this kind of cash flow for the 20 years remaining if it's a 5-year-old system. This would tell us about how much energy is produced, and remember, every year the system will lose about 0.5% of energy produced a year in most systems. Now, some of the newer panels might be a little bit less than 0.5%, but 0.5% is the typical system today. So that discounted cash flow takes into consideration replacement of the inverter at least midway through the life of the system, and the derate factor, that means the loss of energy produced throughout the system, as well as the degradation, which means the loss of energy as it ages. So once you do that, then it brings that dollar amount into today's dollars using a discount rate. So again, that's something that residential appraisers may have a little trouble with, but if they take the course, they'll get some pretty good guidance on how to estimate an appropriate discount rate. So using the appropriate discount rate, you can come up with the value of that system today based on the energy it should produce over its lifetime. Hopefully that helps.
That was great. Thank you. There's a question here. Any data or insight on properties with PACE financing?
Okay, I think you're probably wanting to know, do they sell for less because of the PACE financing? I'm just assuming that's probably the question. We didn't look into the financing particulars of the sales, and so this study did not address that. Now, you could liken that to similar programs that are attached to payment through the real estate taxes. For instance, in Cape Coral, Florida, we have a similar program where you can connect to water and sewer, and you pay it back with a low interest rate over a 20-year term. It's attached to your taxes. In those cases, we found when a house sold, if the seller paid off the loan, the sale price was not affected. But if the borrower assumed the loan or the PACE program, then they would typically that property sold for less than one without the PACE loan. So that's something that each appraiser is going to have to look at in their market. Did the PACE loan, was it paid off by the seller? Did the buyer assume it? If the buyer assumed it, did it affect the sales price they were willing to pay? So we didn't get into that with this study, but it would be an interesting study and something that we'll probably have to address in the future.
Great. Thank you very much. We're being admonished for not pronouncing Oregon correctly. Hopefully I've done it a better job there. Sorry about that. Let's see here. Just a comment, I think a great one. It would be worthwhile doing this study when the ITC is gone. That's a great point. And all of these studies, both this one, the ones that precede us, are a snapshot in time. So unfortunately, we can't get a final answer. We're going to have to consistently be doing this into the future, but that's the same for any other asset. You can think about, stainless steel appliances maybe are in vogue now, but at some point they won't be, and at some point they will make a declaration that, let's say, they don't return their investment, or they aren't something that a buyer really wants, and that is the way that the market reacts. So it is an ongoing process. I think we're providing answers, filling in some gaps, but it will need to be filled in going forward. So good comment there. Let's see here.
There's another one address, Ben, that has someone asked, the average PV residential system in the U.S. is 5 kilowatts. So the average value added to a house is with PV is $378 a watt times 5,000. No, remember, if you're looking at today, well, the study that we did, we only had one sale in 2014. The rest were 2010 through 2013. So the price of solar has gone down. The net cost of solar today in all the markets that I'm aware of is less than $378. And that's going to be your benchmark or your starting point. It's what is the net cost in your local market. So be careful and don't make those assumptions or applications.
Yep, there's a comment here about the sample size. Admittedly, it's not very big, 43 transactions, especially when we've just come off work that's analyzed 4,000 transactions. That wasn't necessarily our expectation. Remember, we presented them with over 200 transactions, figuring we would get a high percentage of those. It was only later that we realized that many of those couldn't be paired. So we came out of it learning a lot more about how that paired sales process works, but less information about those transactions. So, and also note that these transactions were drawn directly from Selling into the Sun, which had a data set that only went through 2013. There are lots of other transactions out there, those that didn't end up in Selling into the Sun, those, meaning other markets, and those that occurred after that in the same market. So this work is work that hopefully will be built on by others. We really hope that it's a springboard for lots of these kinds of analysis to be done in the local markets around the country. It's not very difficult to do this kind of work. You have to be patient, but if you can find the transactions, these kinds of analyses can be done using all the tools that are here. So we encourage others to sort of copycat and conduct all kinds of similar kinds of analysis in other markets. So thanks for pointing that out, and we admit to it. Let's see here. Question, I can't answer this one, Sandy. What is the threshold for how similar homes must be paired? How similar do homes need to be paired? Maybe I think that's what he's asking.
Well, in most cases that are paired sales, we try to find as similar as possible. In other words, if we've had to make a lot of adjustment. Remember, on the secondary market, they don't have any more, but at one time they had 25% gross and no more than 15% net or 10% net, depending on the lender you're working with. We tried to stay within those guidelines. You got to remember, in California, the adjustments, line item adjustment can be pretty heavy. So we try to find as similar as possible to keep those differences down, adjustments down, so that we were really looking at true paired sales. There was no exact number given to the appraisers, but like I said, we had them looked at by more than one appraiser in a market to be sure that that we were looking at credible results.
Let's see here. I've got a lot of comments here. I'm trying to deal with the questions. Can you give a simple example with numbers of how this premium plays out? This is the risk of any of this work like this, because individuals are looking to get an answer and then apply it elsewhere. And what we're really advocating for is not doing that. What we're saying is we can clearly see premiums in these in a variety of markets. And if you look at both appraising into the sun and selling into the sun using different approaches, clearly the market is responding. But if you're going to value an individual home, one needs to calculate that premium by home. So we recommend, for instance, using the PV value tool that gives you an approach using the income method for doing so. If you're looking to appraise a single home, make sure you get a qualified appraiser to do that, one that's familiar with the methodology in doing so, and hopefully we'll be able to find paired sales to pair that home to establish the value in that local market. But I think it's dangerous to say what we're finding any premium that you can then apply elsewhere. So I'm sorry we can't answer your question maybe in as clear a way as you'd want us to. Sandy, I don't know if you want to add anything more to that one.
Oh, I think you've explained that very well, and that's a caution that we've given throughout the report is don't take this and apply it to today's market. Look at the market, the individual market, your kilowatt hour cost, the size of the system, which follows right into this next question here by someone. It says, it's concerning that it sounds like the adjustment for solar PV can be a calculation based on the formula. Adjustments are always market driven, so how can you use a formula? We didn't use a formula in the paired sales analysis. We used the typical paired sale analysis that appraisers are taught to use in all the courses, and we followed residential appraisal procedures. What you may be confusing this with is when I explain the PV value, that is a discounted cash flow is a set of formulas. It's bringing future dollars into today's dollars. That is a test of reasonableness. The secondary mortgage market and USAP tells us to use all applicable approaches. So an applicable approach for something that's producing energy which saves dollars is a cash flow item. So it does deserve income approach analysis if you have the data to do that, to make a credible result. So what we did is with paired sales using the typical paired sale analysis from the appraisal process, and we compared that to the income approach using the discounted cash flow, and we compared that then to net cost. So we have three indications here, and they're all mirroring a very tight range indicating credibility. Hopefully that answers the question about the formula.
Yep, and then I guess we're at the top of the hour. We're going to have to cap it here. There's one more quick question, which is I think I can answer, which is do you have appraisal information for solar homes in other states that weren't, I guess, in this report, such as Texas? And we don't. Sandy, actually, you might know, are there individual homes that have been appraised with PV in Texas, and maybe we can connect that individual with this particular participant here?
I don't have individual names. There is solar PV being installed, and we've had our courses in Texas. They haven't been well attended in the Texas area, but there is solar PV houses being sold with it on it.
Yeah, of course. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate you spending a little time with us today, answering great questions and pointing all kinds of things out. Thank you for your time and your interest. And we're gonna go through these questions and comments one more time. Maybe we can address them directly via email. So with that, we'll end the webinar today, and we can talk. And I just will point out that I also emailed the link to the study, and of course you have our email addresses that have been on the screen. So feel free to contact us directly. All right. Bye-bye.